Good evening, everyone. Welcome. If you could settle down, please, and take your seats. We're going to get started. I am David Cowan. I'm president of the museum. We are the only museum in the nation dedicated to preserving, exhibiting, and teaching about our nation's finances and financial history, and we are a Smithsonian affiliate and a neutral venue. I'd like to acknowledge the support of our sponsor, Voya Financial, tonight, who is bringing us this panel and the reception that will follow. I'd also like to point out the board members in attendance. We have Ewout Steenbergen of Voya Financial, and we're appreciative, sir, as well as Mark Shankman, Alvia Buoff, Randy Del Franco, Glenn Kaufman, Consuelo Mack, David Schuler, and our founder and chairman of the board emeritus, John Herzog. Now, as a museum president, if I had a nickel, or a Bitcoin for that matter, every time someone has come up to me and said, you ought to do a panel on this, or you ought to have an exhibit on that, I could have retired wealthy. But there is one panel that you have been clamoring for, and that is about Bitcoin, and we are proud to tell you we are bringing it to you here tonight. Now, why is that? Well, Bitcoin's been called a lot of things. On the one hand, some are calling it a scam or a Ponzi scheme. And on the other hand, our two Wall Street Journal authors tonight have said, and I quote, "It is quite simply one of the most powerful innovations in finance in 500 years." That's a pretty big divergence of opinions between Ponzi scheme and one of the greatest innovations ever. Now, our format tonight will be that Michael Casey will have a fireside chat with our distinguished guests, former Secretary of the Treasury, Lawrence H. Summers. Michael is a senior columnist covering global finance at the Wall Street Journal and is co-author, along with Paul Vigne, of The Age of Cryptocurrency, How Bitcoin and Digital Money Are Challenging the Global Economic Order. And this will be on sale afterwards, and the authors would be happy to autograph it for you. Now, many of you were here a few months back in the fall when we had former Secretary of the Treasury Timothy Geithner here. And then last month at our gala, we had former Secretary of the Treasury Robert Rubin speaking. And tonight, of course, we're joined by another former Secretary of the Treasury. So that's great programming. And if you want to see more programming like this or are interested in sponsoring programming like this, we'd be delighted to talk with you about that. So please see me or any of the staff afterwards. Now, following the fireside chat, Paul Vigne will lead us in a panel discussion. You have the bios of the people on the panel, but he will make brief introductions. You'll also find 3x5 cards on your seats there to fill out questions, which you'll pass to the aisle for our panelists. Also, for those doubters in the crowd, you're getting a free $5 Bitcoin gift courtesy of Circle. Of course, it expires tomorrow, February 12th, so please act now. And so thank you again to Voya, and once again, I will join you at the end of this exciting program, but it is now my pleasure to turn it over to Michael Casey.
Thanks very much, David. One quick note of housekeeping, and that is that our guest, Dr. Lawrence Summers, has a fairly tight schedule, so we're going to try to move things along fairly quickly here. He's to leave around 6 o'clock. But I don't want to miss the opportunity to make some important thank yous before we move forward, particularly to David for hosting us. Mindy Ross and Kristen Aguilera, just a fabulous job organizing this, and I'd be totally remiss without thanking April Rudin, who came to us with the wacky idea that maybe the Museum of American Finance would possibly be interested in hosting something around our book. So thank you very much, all of you, for helping to set this up. This is one of those rare occasions when I could get away with the idea of saying that the guest I'm here with requires no introduction. But I think it's important to highlight just a few of the points that are the features of the biography of the man to my right. So Larry Summers is, in fact, one of the youngest, if not the youngest, people to ever earn tenure at Harvard University. He was chief economist at the World Bank. During the Clinton administration, he was at first the Undersecretary for International Affairs, and then later, of course, was the Treasury Secretary. He was then president of Harvard University, and then, of course, under President Obama, the director of the National Economic Council. He is currently the President Emeritus of Harvard, but none of this really captures the extent to which Lawrence Summers influences the world and the realm of economic thinking. Perhaps like very few people in the world, Larry Summers looms large over the world of economics. So I'm deeply honored, as is Paul, to have you here as part of this program surrounding our book, and just thank you very much for joining us. But Larry, let me start by saying I interviewed you about a year ago, and I was just intrigued that you'd expressed some interest in Bitcoin and this technology. And you said to me at the time that one of the reasons why you found it interesting was that the world of finance was ripe for disruption, that so much of the economy had been disrupted by information technology, but finance hadn't been. And that was a reason, if nothing else, to pay attention to this kind of technology. And if you don't mind starting off just to lay that out, because that comment drew a lot of attention. So explain that if you don't mind.
Let me just say first that I'm really glad to be at this impressive museum. This is my first visit to it, and based on what I've been able to see, it will not be my last. Let me say that I'm honored to have a chance to be discussing these topics with you, Michael. I think your book is an important contribution to the debate, whatever one's view about the future of Bitcoin. And let me celebrate and acknowledge everybody who's involved in putting this thing together. I think one of the great strengths of American democracy, and it's a largely unheralded strength, is that apart from whatever goes on in Congress or with the president, we have this remarkable capacity to have all these institutions where every issue is debated and discussed at great length. And out of that comes an evolving conventional wisdom, which probably more than any single set of political decision makers' acts ultimately is what shapes the decisions we make as a country. And so I think dialogues like this one, at one level, are a chance for people to see and network with each other and learn a little bit about a subject. But in a deeper and more important sense, I think are part of what drives our democracy to be a progressive enterprise, even at moments when that democracy is most frustrating. Look, here we are in the 21st century, and if I want to buy your house, we're going to end up giving up 7-ish% to the middleman. If I want to buy a refrigerator and I'm happy to pay for it any which way, I have no need to borrow money, I'm going to pay 2.5% to the people who operate and carry on that transaction. The bank sits there and it's paying zero, roughly, in round numbers, to me when I put my money aside. But if I decide that I'm a little short this month and I need to borrow money till next month, it's likely to be in a credit card at 18%. Now, my credit may not be perfect and there are a set of risks along the way, but 18% is really a lot. And so if you think about it, the magnitude of the frictions are actually surprisingly large and have come down by surprisingly little since the days when people who kept track of finance wore green eye shades and had really good pencil sharpeners. And so it is odd to me that we have seen such large innovation, if you like, for money, an ever increasing array of investment vehicles and ways of hedging. But we have seen so little innovation cumulatively directed at taking the frictional costs out of the system. And when you globally have $10+ trillion going, being in one way or another charged on credit cards, and frictional costs of 2.5%, that's $250 billion. That is really a lot of money. That's $800 for every American. And so I think the notion that there's going to be a lot of innovation and experimentation around how those frictional costs can be taken out feels like a very important kind of idea.
What, though, the solution to this
If
problem?
I'm completely predictable, Michael, I'm gonna fail to live up. I'm gonna fail to live up to my reputation, and so
predictable in a completely surprising way. But what about the solution? And here is Bitcoin and or cryptocurrencies of some form, a model on this, resolving the problem you're alluding to, which is the middlemen. And the issue that they're dealing with is this concept of trust, the idea that we need them because we have a very difficult time performing exchange without them. So the thing about this technology that is purported to be its great breakthrough is that it resolves that problem by deferring it to a community, a group. Is this the way to resolve I'm not talking specifically about Bitcoin, but this concept generally, is this some form of this, the way in which we are going to resolve the issues you were just referring to?
First of all, anyone who claims that they know the answers to questions like this for sure is a fool. So the most I can offer you is instincts and judgments. And there are many people in this room who have better informed instincts and judgments than I, and many in this room who have put their money behind, and their careers, in some cases, behind their instincts. I look, and I guess I would say three things. One, I think we're observing more and more the power of well-managed networks, whether it's and complex marketplaces, whether it's Airbnb or whether it's Uber or whether it's Lending Club. We are seeing that with information technology that can permit the development and monitoring of reputations, that systems of complex connection are much more possible than they used to be, and that those contribute to taking frictions out. And so they're likely to spread in different places. Second thing I would say is whatever you think about Mr. Nakatomi's contributions as a financial innovator, I think you have to say that the solution to what computer scientists call the Byzantine generals problem is an impressive intellectual achievement. Byzantine generals problem refers to you got a bunch of Byzantine generals, none of whom trust each other, all of whom need to have a coherent attack plan. And how do you come to a common attack plan when nobody trusts each other? That kind of thing is a very fundamental problem which goes to exchange and commerce in very direct ways. It would be very surprising if it didn't ultimately prove to have a substantial application. After all, the example I used to give when I was at Harvard, president of Harvard, is I would always see it as my role to make the case for basic research. And I would remark on the fact that mathematics was the most abstract of the sciences, that number theory was the most abstract part of mathematics, that the study of prime numbers was a particularly abstract part of number theory, and that progress with respect to understanding prime numbers was integral to the cryptography algorithms that made every ATM in the country possible. And so it would be amazing if the intellectual breakthrough represented in the solution to the Byzantine general problems didn't, in very important kinds of ways, support the process of exchange. Whether or not it will represent some kind of fiat money, I think is very much in doubt. And whether it will represent, whether what will ultimately be significant here is an algorithm of permitting less frictional transactions in commerce, or whether there will be an alternative new store of value, I think is less clear. But that something very significant has happened. I think the prospects for that are quite good. I think it is often the case that people who are centrally involved in inventing things do not correctly prophesy where they're all going to go and where they're going to lead. And my guess is that the tradition from which Bitcoin emanates, which is a kind of hyper-libertarian tradition, is going to be a tradition that if it succeeds, it will leave behind. I do not believe that a major risk in the world is that the dollar, the pound, the euro, and the yen will all be inflated away in a hyperinflationary orgy because of debt, or that that will become a widespread fear. And so if that is the case for Bitcoin, I think it's actually a remarkably weak case. I believe that those who suppose that somehow Bitcoin is going to threaten the sovereignty of nations, that the ability to impose money laundering laws, and capital controls, to tax capital income, and all of that is somehow going to be fundamentally changed because now we have Bitcoin and it transcends international borders, should ponder the fate of trade sports that supposed for a time that it could exist in cyberspace and not be substantially subject to the sovereignty of any nation, and found that to be a highly flawed notion. I don't think anyone should suppose that if the government were to want to crack down in some major way on Bitcoin or on particular uses of Bitcoin, that governments would find themselves unable to do that. And so I think one of the retardants of the growth of these technologies is the hyper-libertarian aura that has surrounded them and that continues to play a role in the statements of some in the community. But I think when Bitcoin is combined and used as a technology, or whether it's Bitcoin, the current Bitcoin, or some successor, I don't pretend to know, that's where I think the real fruit will come.
So what is the role of public policy then? Because if we have an interest in expanding exchange and improving the efficiencies of finance, it's not about stamping it out. It's presumably somehow bringing it within a realm in which it can work. How can government help? And what are the challenges that are faced in bringing regulation to this sphere?
This is an area that I think is rich with irony. If you read the history of the Common Law Corporation, the single most important development in the history of the Common Law Corporation was when the legal principle that it could be sued was established. And you might ask, why was it good to be sued? Well, because if you can't be sued, you can't enter into a binding contract. And only when you could enter into a binding contract could you carry on commerce in a major way. There are internet companies that, and I'm sure I'm oversimplifying the story, but have changed their minds in the last 2 years from loathing the prospect of being taxed to desperately hoping to be taxed, because if they were taxed, then it was clear that their product was legal and needed to be universally accepted. And I think something similar is going to be necessary. Bitcoins, it may or may not be the case that Bitcoins will ever be worth $10,000. But if the day ever comes when Bitcoin accounts for an appreciable fraction of the commerce that takes place in the world economy, it's regulated and subject to safeguards, and people believe that something other than a mathematical algorithm is assuring them that their money will not be stolen, that their transaction will be credited. So I think that it is quite clear that people want to list on exchanges that have stocks on exchanges that have substantial standards. Assets carry more value when they trade in environments where insider trading is restricted, effectively restricted, so that a large number of participants can believe that they're able to participate with a level playing field. And so I think the goal, I think of regulation with respect to Bitcoin as serving two important and in some ways slightly antithetical purposes, but paradoxically, I believe they're ultimately reinforcing purposes, and that is providing basic protection and confidence for what goes on, number one, and number two, providing the legitimacy that makes substantial growth and innovation possible. If there had never been an FAA, there never would have been widespread commercial air travel in the United States. And I believe the analogy carries over.
Let's just, I know you sort of rushed for time, so we're not going to go too much further.
You can do a couple more.
A couple more, good. So we started off talking about finance, and I love the fact that I'm actually on Wall Street. I can refer to Wall Street as a place, not just an abstract entity. But on that context, what is in this for Wall Street? I mean, what role, if it's going to be disintermediated, the world of finance, do banks, do they slide away? Do they take on a different role? Do they co-opt this technology? I mean, I'm not, as you said before, no one has a crystal ball, but what do you imagine Wall Street's reaction if indeed the Bitcoin equivalent of the FAA comes along and turns this into the everything works scenario?
A wide range of outcomes are possible. I think it's pretty clear that Betamax was a better technology than VHS. I think it's pretty clear that the QWERTY typewriter keyboard is not the typewriter keyboard that anybody would invent today. And so I would not minimize the power of incumbency, standards, and an established order as casting a substantial shadow forward with respect to what happens. My Harvard colleague, Clay Christensen, has written, to my mind, rather persuasively on disruptive innovation and the general non-tendency of existing industry leaders to embrace disruptive innovation and to remain as leaders for the next generation. You know, the classic example is Kodak in digital photography. And they don't do it, A, because they worry about cannibalizing their existing product, B, because in the early stages of any innovation, it's not as good on the traditional metrics as the traditional product, and so they don't like it, admire it, and see it as the future. And so I think you'd have to guess that if this flourishes on a large scale, that a substantial part of the innovation will come from institutions that are not mega financial institutions today. And I think you'd have to worry a little bit that we find ways of regulating. You know, there's a kind of easy deal. You existing large financial institutions, accept a little more capital regulation and whatnot than you want. And we, the financial regulatory community, will be very tough on paradigm-breaking challengers. And, you know, that's the history of regulation, that it tends to be very hard on entrants. And that's something I think we should want very much to avoid here, even as we do recognize that there are a set of very necessary protections. And, you know, one thing I've learned over many years is that economists do not have nearly as much imagination about how things can be defrauded as fraudsters do. And so when people got an algorithm that's fraud-proof, well, maybe it is until it isn't. And so I do believe, I do believe that Ronald Reagan sort of had it right when he said, trust but verify. And somebody who agreed with him on virtually nothing, my former Harvard colleague, the late John Kenneth Galbraith, also had it right when he said that conscience is the knowledge that someone is watching. And so I think those insights need to guide our approach to regulation.
On that note, unfortunately, I would just love to keep doing this. I think a lot of people here would love to just pursue this conversation further, but we're going to have to wrap it up because we've got a very tight schedule and you've got to get moving. So listen, Larry Summers, thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure. Please give Larry Summers a round of applause.
Thank you very much, and good luck to all.
Okay.